Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Um, for this lecture, we'll be covering Chapter 12, which deals with cognitive topics in personality. So we'll get started here with a quick introduction to the topic, and we'll define some of the key terms that will be necessary for understanding the rest of the material that we'll be talking about. So when we talk about cognitive approaches to personality, these types of approaches focus on differences in how people process information, essentially, right? So when we think about cognition, or cognitive psychology in general, cognitive psychology includes people's thoughts, their emotions, their motivations, and their behaviors. But when we talk about cognitions, we're talking about people's thoughts, right? So these types of approaches to personality focus more on the cognitions, the thought processes that are involved. So the focus is on how people differ in how they process information, and such differences in how people think are the focus of these cognitive approaches to personality. So a study was done on what people think about when they are exposed to emotion-providing stimuli. This was done by Larson and colleagues in 1987, and the researchers showed people or participants slides of emotion-provoking scenes. Then they asked participants what they thought about what they had just looked at, and this is a technique that's called thought sampling, basically checking in on people regularly to ask them, what are you thinking about at this given moment. So for example, one picture was of a mother holding a child who was bleeding from a pretty severe head wound. And in the study, the researchers were interested in not necessarily what the participants felt, not their emotions, but what they were actually thinking about. So one participant said that they had recalled a memory that their brother had a pretty bad gash on his head that was similar to that in the picture, and that they remember seeing all the blood, and they remember about how upset their mother had become because of that injury, and they remember hearing their brother screaming, and it kind of left the participant feeling confused and helpless. Another participant looked at the same picture and said that head wounds bleed a lot because in the head there's a whole bunch of blood vessels that are pretty close to the surface of the skin. So this person said that they were thinking about the major artery groups that are in the head when they looked at the photo. So we could see that participants saw the same stimuli, saw the same image, but they had very different cognitions. Their thinking was very different. The first person who looked at the photo engaged in what was called personalizing cognition. So that scene prompted this participant to recall a similar event that happened in their own life. The other participant that we talked about, who looked at the same exact picture, engaged in what is called objectifying cognition. So this scene prompted this participant to recall objective facts about, in this case, the distribution of blood vessels that are in the human head. So the difference that exists between these two participants is a difference in cognition. So when we refer to this term cognition, we're referring to awareness and thinking, and to specific mental acts such as perceiving, interpreting, remembering, believing, and anticipating. And all these mental behaviors add up to what is known as information processing, or the transformation of sensory input. So all the signals that are coming from our various sensory organs, including our taste buds and our ears and our eyes and our skin, right? All these different sensory inputs. How these sensory, all this information is transformed into mental representations, and essentially how we manipulate these types of mental representations. So when it comes to the different levels of cognition that are of interest to personality psychologists, there are quite a few. And we'll talk about each of these in greater detail, but an emphasis on information processing when it comes to personality psychology took place during an era that is known as the information age, also known in psychology in particular as the cognitive revolution. So this largely came about with the advent of computers. So we're still in the cognitive revolution in terms of psychology as a school or as a field. We're still very much in the cognitive era. Some of the errors that have come before that, of course, was the Freudian era, and behaviorism had a really good run. But since the 1970s, we've been in this cognitive approach to psychology and the human mind. And humans in some ways are like computers, right? In that we spend a lot of our time processing information. We spend a lot of our time in this processing information, or information processing mode. But unlike computers, humans are not always accurate. Remember, our brains are built to be efficient, not necessarily accurate. And humans are biased. So we don't act like computers in the way that we process information, because we have lived experiences, right? And we have pre-existing knowledge that influences the way that we perceive events and the way that we interpret incoming information or new information. So when we talk about this idea of perception, this is the process of imposing some type of order on information that's received by our sensory organs. So our brain is bombarded with a bunch of information coming from all of our sensory organs. Perception is the process by which we establish some type of order, some type of categorization of this information. The second level of cognition that would be interesting, or that would be of interest to personality psychologists, is interpretation. So this is how we make sense, or how we explain the events that take place around us. So when we talk about interpretation, this concerns the giving of meaning to events. So how we give meaning to certain events. When you are confronted with an event and you are asked, what does this mean? Or you're asked, how did this happen and how will it turn out? What will the outcome be? We're likely to engage in the act of interpretation. We're really kind of trying to make sense of what's going on and trying to, by making sense of what's going on, we're able to come up with some anticipated outcomes, we would say. So the third level of cognition that is of interest to personality psychologists is people's conscious goals. And these are the standards that people develop for evaluating themselves and evaluating others. So people will develop specific beliefs about what is important in life and what tasks are, let's say, appropriate to pursue in order to meet these important things, these important goals, let's say, in life. So some of these goals might be age specific. Our goals might change as we get older, or as we progress through life. We're focused on accomplishing different things, and these goals might be related to culture. Certainly culture, the culture that we are raised in is going to help shape the type of goals that we set for ourselves and for others. So we could think about, Western cultures tend to be more individualistic compared to, say, Eastern cultures that tend to be more collectivist. So if we grow up in a Western culture, goals that are related to establishing our independence from our families might be a priority, particularly when we're younger. So people who come from, say, more collectivist cultures, their goals might be focused more on actually staying with the family, and taking care of the family. And the way that we measure our success or self-esteem actually differs depending on what kind of culture that we're in. If we're in more Western, independent or individualistic cultures versus, say, more collectivist cultures, more individualistic cultures, we rely heavily on ourselves for self-esteem. People from collectivist cultures will rely more on their group, on their in-group, or their in-groups, plural, and the success and the accomplishments of those in-groups to say, feed or to bolster their self-esteem. So when it comes to interpretation, when it comes to conscious goals, just be aware that our culture plays a big part in helping. Well, let's say helping. It's usually not very helpful. A lot of these goals are unrealistic and lead to feelings of self-doubt and low self-esteem for a lot of us. But let's say that they are important in terms of our culture is important in terms of what goals we set for ourselves. And the final topic in cognitive psychology is, or the cognitive approaches, rather, to personality psychology is the notion of intelligence. This is an issue that we have spoken about before in previous lectures, that the concept of intelligence is a bit controversial, but as a psychology major, it's something you should, probably have a pretty good grasp on, and not just a grasp on what intelligence is or the various ways in which it's defined, but also the problems that are associated with this concept, and not just the, say, social issues or social problems that are associated with this, but also the psychometric issues that are associated with it, or even the conceptual issues, like what the hell actually is intelligence, right? Kind of really depends on who you ask. Okay, so when it comes to perception, there are two areas that we'll talk about, or that your book goes into in some detail in this chapter. And the first is this notion of field dependence versus field independence, and also this, let's say, phenomenon, or phenomenon is the right word, but essentially people's tolerance to pain, and how pain tolerance is an example of people's inclinations to, or their proclivities, or their predispositions for sensation reducing or sensation augmenting. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail. So when it comes to field dependence or field independence, field independent people tend to have the ability to focus on details despite the clutter of background distractions. So field dependent people would have a more difficult time doing this, because they would be, well, as the name suggests, field dependent. The way that they are processing individual details of a particular scene, or image, or any stimuli that is that they are presented with, they're going to be more reliant on, let's say, the background in order to understand the specifics of this stimuli. So field independent people will function more with more autonomy, and display a more impersonal or detached orientation towards others. We'll talk about the different personality traits associated with field dependent and field independent people in a moment here. But people who are field independent tend to just be independent overall. So in the way that they just say as their personality, or in how they interact with other people. So not just in how they process information, but this also tends to be reflected in how they behave, or how they treat others. So they tend to not be very interested in other people's opinions. They might be more inclined to keep their distance from other people's, or other people, people's, and they tend to show a preference for non-social type of activities or situations. So That's of course in relation to field dependent people who would be, let's say, more outgoing. They'll show a strong or stronger interest in other people, and field dependent people tend to prefer to be physically closer to other people, and they'll tend to get along with other people fairly well, and they will actually seek out say social type of situations. So those are some of the personality differences. But how exactly do we measure field dependence or field independence? Well, there are a couple of measures to assess field dependence. One is the rod and frame test, and the other is the embedded figures test. So the rod and frame test consists of a movable rod inside of a frame. So basically the participant must make adjustments to the rod and adjust it to a true vertical position as the frame is changed. So how do we describe this? So it's literally just a rod that the participant needs to keep in a true vertical position, right? As the background is changing, as this frame is changing, they need to keep that rod in a true vertical position. This is what the rod and frame test essentially is. So the degree of error is the measure used to score the test. So essentially, how well are people able to keep this rod in a vertical position as the background, as the frame is changing. So the higher the score, the more field dependent the participant is. So essentially, the more error they were making. So they were having a harder time keeping that rod perfectly vertical as the background changed, right? So they were dependent on what was happening in the field, what was happening in the background. And the more field independent the participant is, the lower their score would be. So the less error they would make. They would have an easier time keeping this rod, keeping this line perfectly vertical as the background change. Another measure for assessing field dependence is the embedded figures test, and this consists of finding and tracing a simple form, and this could be just outline of a figure or a shape that's embedded within a larger, more complex type of image. So when it is, sometimes it's the complexity of the background could also involve differing colors. It could be a mismatch of different colors back there, that people need to find these hidden shaped or hidden figures that are within this larger, more complex type of background. So those demonstrating high performance on the test would be defined as being field independent. So these are the people who are able to pick out these forms and to pick out these figures and within this really complex and confusing type of background. And those who would make more errors or would have more difficulty picking out these shapes or these images would be considered more field dependent. So there are a couple of ways to measure field dependency, and as I said, there are a couple of personality findings. that research has shown through several studies, so they tend to be pretty consistent. But when it comes to field independence or dependence and life choices in education, field independent people tend to favor natural sciences, math, and engineering, where field dependent people tend to favor the social sciences and education and the arts even. In interpersonal relations, field independent people are more interpersonally detached. This is what we mentioned before. They tend to be less interested in social situations and less likely to seek out opportunities for social interaction, whereas field dependent people tend to be more attentive to social cues and are oriented towards other people. So they tend to be more social. Let's say they tend to also seek out opportunities where social interaction would be more likely to occur. Current research on field dependence and independence. Well, some research has shown that field independent people are better able to screen out distracting information and focus on the task. So people who are field independent might be less socially oriented, but they're definitely much more oriented to detail. They have much better attention to detail, and they're able to focus out or ignore any type of distracting information. Field independent students tend to learn more effectively than field dependent students in hypermedia based instructional environments. So again, field independent students are able to focus on what is important, or not just focus on, but able to distinguish what is important and what is not important when it comes to what they should be paying attention to. Okay, so the way in which people perceive their surroundings and navigate through information, whether they tend to focus on the whole or they tend to notice the particulars. So those who focus on the whole would be the field dependent people, and those who focus on the details or the particulars, those would be the field independent people. Whether we're doing one or the other, this is what's referred to as our perception style. But there are other differences or other individual differences when it comes to perception. One commonly noticed difference between people is pain tolerance. So this is the extent to which we're able to endure uncomfortable type of physical stimuli. I don't know about you, but I have a very low pain threshold. It really kind of depends, I guess. I don't do well with being sick. So, like, pain when it comes to like a cut, or I've broken some bones before. Like those are not pleasant, but they don't bother me as much as just like a cold. A cold will start getting to my head, like psychologically start messing with me. So I have a low tolerance for that. But I mean, you could think about yourself in terms of your tolerance for pain. But we have quite a bit of research that takes a look at individual differences in regard to pain tolerance. And Anastath Petrie's reducer augmenter theory of pain tolerance is still quite popular, and by that I mean still generally accepted. Petrie studied people in hospitals who were undergoing painful operations, as well as just ordinary subjects in whom she actually induced pain. And she induced pain either by applying heat or coldness, or by putting weights on their joints in their fingers to cause pain. And she was actually able to, through these studies, able to quantify how well each subject could tolerate pain. So she was able to actually measure how well these participants could tolerate this pain. And she developed a theory that people with low pain tolerance had a nervous system that amplified or augmented, let's say, sensory cues. So, in other words, people who have a low pain tolerance, who can't tolerate pain very well, actually have a nervous system that amplifies, that ups sensory inputs. So not just from your pain receptors, but from all of your senses. And those who could tolerate pain very well, those who could take a lot of pain without it causing much discomfort, she believed that these people had a nervous system that actually reduced or dampened the sensory inputs to the brain. So, for these reasons, her theory came to be called the reducer augmenter theory, and it refers to the dimension along which people differ in terms of their reaction to not just pain, but all sensory stimuli. So we can take a look at some of the results that this line of research has produced or has found. And people with low pain tolerance, again, this is part of the theory here, have a nervous system that is amplified or augmented, and people with a high pain tolerance have a sensory system that's dampened or reduced. So reducers should be motivated to seek strong stimulation in order to compensate for their lower sensory reactivity. So in other words, people who have a high pain tolerance, remember what the theory is saying is that, well, they have a high pain tolerance because their nervous system kind of dampens their sensory inputs, kind of slows it down, kind of pushes it down. So these people will be more, let's say, inclined to seek out high sensory type of events, because it kind of takes more to get a thrill for them, so to speak. So reducers should be motivated to seek out this strong stimulation, and an easy way of seeking out strong stimulation is through drugs, right? Mind-altering chemicals. So reducers may use substances like nicotine and caffeine, alcohol, other drugs to artificially lift this type of arousal level. When we talk about personality, we were talking about perception there. Once we get into the realm of interpretation, so again, how are we organizing this information. How are we using it to, let's say, answer questions about the world around us? We have a couple of theories that relate to this part of cognition, the interpretation aspect. The first is Kelly's personal construct theory. The second is locus of control, and the third is learned helplessness. So we'll take a look at each of these. Okay, sorry there. PowerPoint froze on me for a second. Okay, so when we take a look at Kelly's personal construct theory, Kelly was a psychologist who largely operated in the, let's say, in his career, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and he played an important role in starting the cognitive tradition. He was one of the founding members of the cognitive revolution, let's say, within personality psychology. He was a clinical psychologist, and he believed that people are motivated to understand their circumstances and to be able to predict what will happen to them in the near future. So Kelly viewed human nature as humans kind of like being scientists, that we make inferences, that we're naturally curious about the world around us and curious about the future. So we'll engage in efforts to try to understand and control and predict the different events that happen in our lives. So when people don't know why some event happened, according to Kelly, we'll experience greater distress than if we had an explanation. So we're motivated to seek out these type of explanations in order to reduce our stress and our anxiety, and we seek them out, or seek these explanations out, much the same way that a scientist might seek out explanations for some particular phenomenon in a laboratory. So when it comes to, let's say, scientists, they employ constructs to interpret observations, and a construct doesn't exist per se, right? So when we talk about constructs, psychology, we deal with constructs all the time. So what exactly is happiness, right? I don't know, right? What is love? These are constructs. These are things that we can't, put somebody on a scale and measure how much love they have. We can't give a blood test and find out how much love they have in their system, so to speak, right? So these are these types of theoretical variables that we deal with all the time. So when it comes to, say, personal constructs, this is the notion that no two people are going to have exactly the same type of construct system. So what you believe is, or how you define happiness, is going to be different in some way than than anyone else's construction of happiness, or how you define love. What love means to you could be very different than what it means to anybody else. So we have these constructs that we use to interpret and try to predict events, and these constructs are unique to ourselves. So again, no two people are going to have the same personal construct system, and so their own unique interpretation of the world is inevitable, right? So again, we all have our own unique interpretation of the world, that we make predictions based on that interpretation. So according to Kelly, all constructs are bipolar, meaning that they exist on a continuum. So you can think of, happiness as being existing on a continuum of severe depression or complete lack of happiness to, nirvana, I guess, right? So like extreme contentment or jubilance, jubilation, not jubilation, jubilation, some type of extreme type of happiness. So according to Kelly, these constructs are bipolar. They exist on a continuum, and everyone's going to be somewhere between those extreme opposites in there. So when it comes to, let's say, Kelly and postmodernism, so those of you, I'm not going to go into postmodernism in much detail, but essentially postmodernism says that there's no real objective reality, that reality is pretty much just subjective, and that there's no objective right or wrong. So even like things like morality is subjective. It kind of all depends on the individual. In the notion that Kelly is postmodern, George Kelly was postmodernist. People will see his theory as being a postmodernist theory, because he essentially said that we kind of create our own worlds. We all perceive and interpret our environments very differently. So we all have a unique interpretation of what we see and what we hear, or everything that we experience. And these unique interpretations, these will form unique constructs, or at least unique definitions of these constructs. So we all have individual understandings of these constructs. So when I say, I'm feeling happy, you don't really know what that means, right? Because that's my understanding of happiness, which might be very different than your understanding of it. So in this regard, Kelly is often seen as a postmodernist, or his theory is seen as being a postmodernist theory, in that there is no real objective truth. Everything is kind of subjective or based on the individual, and it's, kind of hard to argue with that, because there's really no way of proving even that what you interpret as the color red is what I interpret as the color red. There's no way to prove that we both see the same color, right? Even if the same wavelength is approaching our eyes, because I actually had a professor in my doctoral program at Brooklyn College try to address this question, and he proved no, the eye is picking up the same exact wavelength. Okay, but that's sensation, right? So we're talking about perception. There's no way to prove that your brains are perceiving that wavelength of red, let's say, the same way. So yeah, there's some ambiguity there. So when it comes to this idea of, let's say, personality and constructs, with Kelly's theory, he presented a highly complex but systematic theory of personality and personal construct. His most basic idea was the fundamental postulate, which refers to the statement that a person's processes are psychologically channelized by the way in which they anticipate events. So to this fundamental postulate, Kelly added a number of corollaries. For example, if two people have similar construct systems, they would be psychologically similar. That is, they would have a commonality corollary. So some couples might be quite different in lots of ways, but if their personal construct systems are similar, then they are likely to get along pretty well. So this might explain, let's say, in the unusual circumstance when quote unquote opposites attract, we might, be considering people to be opposite based on very superficial types of characteristics. According to Kelly, if their construct, if their idea of, if they both kind of are similar in regard to their idea of what is happiness, what is love, what is morality, what is truth, what is honor, whatever these constructs are, if they tend to be pretty similar in that regard, if their construct systems tend to be fairly similar, they're likely to get along. They're likely to if it's a friendship, likely to be pretty tight friendship. If it's a romantic relationship, likely to be a healthy, long-lasting type of relationship there. So lots of different personality theorists. Kelly also devoted a special place, or devoted a part of his theory there to the concept of anxiety. So for Kelly, anxiety was the result of not being able to understand and predict life events. So in his terms, anxiety is the result of our personal constructs failing to make sense of our circumstances. So our personal constructs, our beliefs in the world, the way that we interpret the world, aren't making sense for our particular circumstances. What's going on in front of us right now? We can't make sense of it. So this leads to a state of anxiety, according to Kelly. Basically, it's a failure of our construct system to explain what's going on, what we're experiencing. So people are anxious when they don't understand what is happening to them, and when they feel that events are unpredictable or outside of their control. This is why we're seeing a huge rise of anxiety now with the pandemic. Right, it's a lot of nothing's really predictable. Right, there's tons of uncertainty, and it's a pandemic. It's a virus. Whether you get it or not is largely outside of your control, right? There are certain things that we can do. Wearing masks, washing our hands, those things can certainly help. But, ultimately, there's a general lack of unpredictability and a lack of control, let's say. So how do these constructs fail? How do these personal constructs fail in terms of making sense of what's happening to us? If we were talking about social psychology, we might start getting into a conversation about cognitive dissonance here, right? Because these constructs might fail to describe the situation that's going on in front of us, or the circumstances that we're experiencing. But the human mind, we're pretty good at deceiving ourselves and rationalizing and justifying, right? We're pretty good at making stuff fit, making those constructs work, even though they don't at all. But this is Kelly's theory. So, what did he say? Well, he said that sometimes our constructs might be too rigid, and impermeable to new experiences. So, essentially something might come along, some event might happen, some situation we might find ourselves in, that our constructs didn't anticipate, or our constructs didn't foresee or didn't incorporate. So our constructs are too rigid, that we're unable to apply them to this new, say, event, or this new series of events or circumstances that we're faced with. This will cause anxiety because we're unable to explain what's happening, and we feel a sense that we have no control. So we feel a lack of control in here. So another way that these constructs fail is that they might be too permeable. So almost the opposite. If a person applies them too liberally. So essentially, if you start to apply these categories, these constructs too liberally, then they don't really do a good job of explaining anything, because they basically explain everything, if that makes sense. So sometimes these constructs are not well defined. They're too liberal. They're too what's a good way of explaining this? You can really apply them to everything, so they kind of become useless in terms of explaining the events that are taking place in front of you, right? This is the issue that we run into when it comes to grand theories of human behavior. Saying that a theory that explains everything explains nothing, and this is one of the issues that scientists will take a concept that scientists will take issue with is the existence of God, at least as the God as an explanation for events. So why is it raining? Well, because of God. Why do we have earthquakes? Well, because of the God, right? Why do people die? Well, God, right? Okay, this God seems to be a theory of everything, so it really is explaining nothing, right? So again, another reason why the God issue might not be might not be a scientific issue, but plenty of scientists who disagree with me and say it is a scientific issue. Okay, so another say issue that is related to interpretation of people's perception is the idea of locus of control. So some people will, well, let's just first talk about what locus of control is about. So it describes a person's perception of responsibility for events in his or her life, or their life. So people who have an external locus of control, they will have a generalized expectancy that events are outside of their control. Again, locus of control is measured on a continuum. So it's not that you have internal or external, but all of us will be somewhere in between these polar opposites, right? But external locus of control basically means we feel that events in our lives are almost predetermined. They're outside of our control. Those of us with an internal locus of control, we have a generalized expectancy that reinforcing events are under one's control, and that one is responsible for major outcomes in life. So people with very strong internal locus of control will they be very much in favor of, say, individual responsibility. They believe they would have, say, stronger sense of autonomy than people who have an external locus of control. So when we take a look at people's overall locus of control, we're asking, in general, do they typically see events as being outside of their sphere of influence, right? As being external to them, or as being internal to them, something that they have control over, that things in life they're able to control, to predict, let's say. So Rodder's expectancy model of learning behavior is related to this issue of locus of control. And this model says that learning depends on the degree to which a person expected reinforcements, and also that some believe that they are in control of outcomes, whereas others believe that they're not in control of outcomes. So this type of expectancy model, some people might fail to see, say, the connection between their behavior and some type of reinforcement. If they're not expecting to experience a reinforcement for their behavior, then they're not likely to see it. And some people who are expecting a reinforcement for their behavior might see a reinforcement or experience a reinforcement, even if there isn't really one, if there isn't necessarily one, they might perceive something as being a reinforcement or a reinforcer, and by definition it becomes a reinforcer, right? So essentially this theory is saying that our expectations for outcomes in particular events will affect how we interpret those events and how we interpret those outcomes, and that in turn will affect what we learn from those events and from those outcomes, whether we are, say, reinforced or not, whether our behaviors are reinforced or not. Depends on whether we see a reinforcement there, or if we expect a reinforcement or reinforcer to be there. Learned helplessness. So this is the theory that was developed, it's part of learning theory, and it's actually kind of a bit of a sad line of research that resulted in this theory, learned helplessness theory. So I'll just give you the rundown here. Essentially, it involved dogs and electricity, right? So you probably are familiar with this from intro to psych, or maybe some other of your classes here. But researchers put dogs in a cage with the metal floor, and there was a little divider in the cage that dogs were able to jump over. And what would happen is the dog would just be chilling out on one side of the cage, and the researchers would electrify the floor, basically electrocuting the dogs. And then the dogs would say, "Yo, what the hell?" And they would jump over to the other side where they were no longer getting electrocuted. So the dogs, figured that out pretty quickly. They could just jump over to the other side and be fine. Okay, well, then the researchers put a collar and a chain on the dog, and had the dog chilling on the side of the cage. Then they would electrify the floor, electrocuting the dog, and the dog would try to jump over to the safe side, but they were constrained. They were tethered by this chain, so they weren't able to jump over to the other side. And the dogs would keep trying and trying and trying, and eventually they would just give up. And there was I forgot to mention that before the floor was electrified, there was a light or a buzzer that would go off. So it's kind of a cue to the dog. Okay, bzz, or this light would go off and be like, okay, you're gonna get electrocuted, right? So they kind of gave a warning in a sense. So the point is that the dogs developed learned helplessness. They developed or they learned that there was nothing that they could do to change the outcome, that they were going to be electrocuted no matter what. So they stopped trying. They stopped trying to jump over to the safe side. And that was true even after the collar and the chain were removed. So the collar and the chain were removed from dogs, so now they were free to jump over to safety, but they didn't do it. They sat there and they took the pain, right? Because they had learned that there was nothing that they could do, so they gave up hope. Now that's a horrible story, especially if you're an animal person like me, right? And I have two black labs. One we adopted from Lebanon. He's blind. Somebody shot him in the face with a pellet gun several times and blinded him, and we think they fucked up his jaw as well. That they must have broken his jaw. Guess he's got a little thing going on with his jaw. But yeah, anyway, so if you're an animal person, that's a horrific story, and it's pretty messed up research there. It also, kind of explains where a lot of us are now, humans, us now in this world around us, right? We're all kind of, well, a lot of us are feeling a little bit of this learned helplessness here. Definitely not good. The saving grace to this line of research is that when the researchers actually picked up the dogs and put them on the other side of the cage, the dogs learned again that they could escape the shock, and then they basically were able to overcome the learned helplessness, but they had to be shown how to do that. They had to be shown that it was possible, right? So something interesting to think about in terms of humans, of overcoming our learned helplessness, right? Might be time for some revolutionary type of person to come around and show us that we can control things, we can change things in our society here, right? Okay, so when it comes to learned helplessness and when it comes to locus of control, this is all about both theories are about expectancies, right? So what are people or dogs expecting to experience, and how do these expectancies just affect behaviors, right? Essentially, it's what it comes down to. So in locus of control theory, people who have an external perspective believe that life events are outside of their control, similar to people who have gone through helplessness training. So essentially, people who've kind of experienced learned helplessness also believe that these events are outside of their control. When it comes to, let's say, an internal locus of control, people believe that these events are within, or they expect outcomes to be within their control. And again, both theories come down to this notion of expectations and how we explain the situations that we're in, right? So we could speak of explanatory style as the tendency that some people have to use certain attributional categories when explaining causes of events. So what are attributional categories? Attributions are just explanations. So when we make an attribution, we're basically trying to explain a particular behavior, or we're trying to explain something by attributing that thing to some cause. So there are three broad categories of attributions: external or internal. So external, when we talk about external attributions, just imagine somebody does something, something bad to you. You will likely make one of two attributions: an internal or external attribution about that person and why they did this bad thing to you. It's either because they're a horrible person, right? It's something internal to them, or it's because they're something about their situation. They're going through a really difficult time right now, right? They did something really bad something bad to you because of something bad going on in their environment. This would be an external attribution that you would make for this person's behavior. The attribution, or let's say their behavior, is either stable or it's unstable. If it's stable, this means, this is kind of how they are all the time. This is, this is kind of how they always act, right? And it could be internal and be stable, or it could be external and it could be stable. It means they're always act that way because they're constantly in a really shitty environment, right? Really shitty circumstances there. Or it could be unstable, meaning, they don't usually act this way, right? So, this type of attribution that we give to a person's behavior is that's a stable type of behavior, something we expect from them, or something, that's unexpected, not necessarily stable there. And then also global or specific, meaning that the person acts like this towards everything, right? So it's, they're just always mean to everyone about every issue. Or it might be specific, is that they might, just get mean under because of a very specific type of topic of conversation, or under very specific type of circumstances. So again, this issue of global, that they're always like this, or they're like this for every type of topic, or this behavior is very specific, deals only with, say, this type of scenario under these types of conditions. When it comes to a learned helplessness, the explanatory style that most puts a person at risk for feelings of helplessness and poor adjustment is one that emphasizes internal, stable, and global causes for bad events. So this is what's known as the pessimistic explanatory style. So people who have this type of pessimistic explanatory style will tend to make internal attributions about why things are going bad, typically about themselves, right? So it's something about me that is causing this, and not something about my environment, right? They'll also tend to make stable attributions for the causes for negative outcomes, meaning, this is stuff that doesn't change and that can't be changed, and that these attributions are global, meaning they kind of apply to every aspect of my life, let's say, right? So not in specific areas, but yeah, just overall, every aspect of my life. These are bad, say, attributions. So this is associated with this pessimistic explanatory style is associated with lower self-esteem, depression, anxiety, you name it, right? And what we see through the research is that explanatory style tends to actually be pretty stable over time. So this is why we speak of, let's say, learned helplessness or even locus of control as quote-unquote personality characteristics, or at least related to personality, because these types of explanatory styles, they tend to be pretty stable. If you're kind of a pessimistic person when you're younger, you're likely to remain that way, and when you get older, and vice versa, in terms of being an optimistic person. Okay, so when we talk about the idea of this other part of perception, deals with goals, right? The different goals that we set for ourselves. Well, people differ in their goals, and these differences can reveal and are part of, let's say, a person's personality, at least according to personality psychologists who believe this, who go along with this. So when it comes to, let's say, the different types of goals that we set for ourselves, if they are a reflection of our personalities, then we would be able to evaluate people's goals and learn something about their personalities based on the different goals that they set for themselves. So when it comes to, I'm just trying to find the easiest part for me to try to get through this quickly. We're coming up to an hour and 20 minutes here, so go through my notes here. Okay, well, I guess I'll just talk about the personal projects analysis that was developed by Little 2007-2011. Little developed the personal projects analysis method for assessing people's personal goals, their personal projects, and what he had participants do was first generate a list of their personal projects, as many or as few as they deemed relevant, that these projects that would help people attain their goals. He had them list them out. On average, most people listed about 15 personal projects that are currently important in their daily lives, to help these projects, again, to help them reach their goal. He next had participants rate each project on several scales, such as how important the project is to them, how difficult it is, how much they enjoyed working on these projects, how much progress they have made on each of these projects, and the negative and positive impacts these projects have had on their lives. And essentially what Little was able to find was that overall happiness that people experience is most related to feeling in control of one's personal projects. in other words, feeling in control of one's personal goals, or the path that you're on to reach your goals. Happiness was related to feeling in control of these projects, feeling unstressed about these projects, so not being too stressed out about them, and being optimistic that these projects will end successfully. So these aspects of the personal project analysis, basically low stress, high control, and high optimism, tend to predict overall levels of happiness and life satisfaction. So we see a number of studies that have showed that these are good predictors for happiness and satisfaction with life. So the final part of information processing, the final component is this idea of intelligence, which we've mentioned before as being quite controversial in psychology. So it's controversial for a number of reasons. I would say that I guess the most basic is there's really no clear definition of what intelligence actually is, right? So we can define intelligence as being associated with educational attainment, so how much knowledge a person has acquired, say relative to other people who are their same age. I mean, that's really what the IQ intelligence quotient really was all about, was comparing people's intellectual abilities for based on their age. It's evolved since then, but still this idea of comparing, say, intelligence to or acquired knowledge that an individual has, comparing that acquired knowledge of that individual to their peers. This would be, say, an achievement view of intelligence, essentially asking or measuring how much a person has achieved in terms of knowledge attainment or skill attainment in some ways, right? But other definitions view intelligence less as a product of education and more as an ability to become educated. So essentially less about what somebody knows or has learned and more about a person's ability to learn. So this type of view is known as the aptitude view. So this would be somebody's potential, right? So traditional measures of intelligence, these so-called IQ tests, have been often used and interpreted as aptitude measures, but that's quite debatable, especially when you take a look at some of the earlier versions of these tests. They ask questions that somebody who wasn't necessarily a heavy reader early in their lives might do poorly on these tests. They're also highly biased in terms of various cultural various cultural norms that are asked on these tests, or the way that certain questions are framed, let's say, might be more people from various racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups might be have more familiarity with the types of words that are used on some of these tests, with even the way that some of these questions are structured, what they're actually asking on there. So there's a bit of controversy when it comes to if these tests are biased in favor of a particular group or biased against a particular group. Again, going back to this idea of exactly what is intelligence, nobody has a really clear definition on this. Gardner has a widely accepted definition. He states intelligence as being the application of cognitive skill and knowledge to solve problems, learn, and achieve goals that are valued by the individual and the culture. Okay, so he definitely acknowledges that culture is playing a role in there, but also valued by the individual and culture. There's a whole lot of stuff in here that might be actually hard to measure, right? So earlier thoughts of intelligence basically reduced IQ, or say intelligence, not necessarily IQ. IQ is intelligence quotient. It's a very particular form of or way of calculating or measuring IQ. But see, intelligence was often thought of as just say a characteristic, kind of like a personality trait, something that somebody was kind of just born with or developed pretty early in life, that remained pretty stable throughout their life. And this was kind of just your general intelligence, often referred to as just G, the factor G. We see in Gardner's definition, he kind of opens it up, right? This whole idea of valued by not just the individual, but culture. And Gardner actually developed a theory of multiple intelligences. So he, in his definition, or his, let's say, my brain is cutting out. I need to get some sleep here. Pulling an all-nighter. In his way of defining intelligence, he came up with 7 different factors, or several different components that make up intelligence. The first is interpersonal intelligence. So these involve social skills, your ability to communicate and get along with others. And intrapersonal intelligence. So this is your ability to be insightful, to understand your own emotions and your own motivations. He also include kinesthetic intelligence. So this describes the abilities of people who have really good, say, hand-eye coordination, or the abilities of athletes and dancers. He also mentions musical intelligence. So, those of you who play an instrument, or rather those who can't play an instrument, we probably understand that concept pretty well. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences it's not without its own criticism there, right? It's kind of, well, where do you end? Why only 7, right? I mean, we can, if we're going to talk about dancing or acrobatics as a form of intelligence, then where do we end? Some of his theories or some of those intelligences have been supported with factor analysis, with statistical analyses, but it's still an area of contention. One thing that Gardner kind of hinted at when it came to his component of interpersonal intelligence, but he didn't really delve into, but was later added, and this notion of emotional intelligence is pretty generally accepted. If not generally accepted, it's something that we all kind of know about, and there's some research that shows that this concept can be accurately measured, and that is useful for making predictions. So what is emotional intelligence? Well, traditional measures of intelligence tend to predict school performance and achievement and maybe aptitude or people's potential ability, but not necessarily outcomes later in life, such as occupational attainment or salary or marital quality. But emotional intelligence actually tends to predict these life outcomes pretty strongly in the research. So what exactly is emotional intelligence? Well, according to Goldman, these emotional intelligence includes a set of 5 specific abilities. The first is having an awareness of one's own feelings and bodily signals, and being able to identify one's own emotions and to make distinctions between different emotions. Also, ability to regulate emotions, especially negative emotions, and to manage stress. Also, the ability to control one's impulses, such as directing one's attention and effort, delaying gratification, and staying on task towards goals. The ability to decode social and environmental cues of others, and to empathize with other people, to be able to feel what other people are feeling. Finally, the ability to influence and guide others without incurring anger and resentment. So that last one sounds like a little bit of being able to manipulate or being able to direct people's behaviors and emotions without them getting pissed off at you, right? There's also this notion of cultural intelligence, or at least the notion that we need to view intelligence within a cultural context. So, according to many psychologists, not just personality psychologists, but I mean, intelligence, that's a concept that kind of splits across all fields, or most fields of psychology here. So, according to this cultural context of intelligence, one should view intelligence as comprised of the skills valued within a particular culture. Again, as a social psychologist, I would say, well, what if you are not accepted by your culture? Or what if you don't accept your culture? Or what if you don't value the culture that you were born into, right? It doesn't really make room for that. You can imagine some cultures are more tolerant of differences in people's beliefs and behaviors than others. So I don't know if we're dealing with a pretty repressive culture, maybe not a very open or quote unquote intelligent culture here, they might value things that you don't value, that you don't want to be a part of, right? So I don't know. This idea of intelligence is complicated, let's say, right? Okay, so just to summarize this chapter here, cognitive approaches to personality focus on differences in how people process information. People differ in how they think, how they perceive, interpret, remember, believe, desire, and anticipate events in their lives. And personality psychologists are interested in these differences, as well as characteristics of cognition that all humans share. So we didn't really talk much about the commonalities, those characteristics of cognition that all of us share. We focus mostly on the differences here, but hopefully this chapter was interesting, and hopefully it was insightful, particularly in terms of how it explained how our beliefs and how our goals and how our personalities, quote unquote personalities, might be influenced or dependent even on how we perceive the world and how we interpret our perceptions and the kind of goals that we set for ourselves. Okay, I am falling asleep here, so we will revisit this information again when we meet in a synchronous meeting, and I will be well rested. So hopefully, if I rambled too much today, I'll be much sharper when we meet in, well, I'll say meet in person, when we meet online to review the lectures. Okay, so until then, get some rest, as I will. I'll see you soon. Take care.